There we go. Okay, welcome. Couple of folks, I think, newly joining us here. So welcome. These are our third Thursday calls where we connect with other folks leading missional communities, missional initiatives in their parishes, leaders on the ground, and often diocesan level leaders too, who are supporting us in our work. And our topic today, Erendira is going to lead us in some conversation. I'll introduce her again in a minute, but around Gen Z and that sort of religious and spiritual experience, and then also maybe how this new generation is playing a role, an active role in the ways that we are making decisions and reaching out and engaging in our church planting efforts. But as we're getting started, I thought it might just be interesting to very briefly go around, because I'd like to hear these out loud, not just in the chat box. If you would say your name and where you are, and then you don't need to explain it, but just what's a cultural phenomenon that you sensed helped shape your generation's posture around religion, or that you help define your generation's religious experience. Let me put those questions here in the just questions for introductions here in the chat box. Okay. So who and where you are and a cultural phenomenon that helped define your generation's religious experience. So I'll model this. I'm Katie Nakamura Ringers. I am in Birmingham, Alabama. I'm the staff officer for church planting. And the cultural phenomenon that I think is still defining my generation, I'm late millennial, is the Left Behind series of books. I'm going to call on people. How about you, Jonathan?
You threw me for a loop on that one. I'm Jonathan Myers. I'm in the Diocese of Spokane, vicar of the West Central Abbey. Left Behind is really good. I'm in that bridge generation as well between Gen X and millennial. I'm gonna say the what do you call it? The reveal in Boston around the abuse in the Catholic Church was the film Spotlight that was made about that. I think that has a lot of reverberations.
Good. How about you, Thomas Barron?
Thanks, Katie. So I'm Thomas Barron. I am the Diocese of Georgia. I am a church plant in Grovetown, and I am Gen X. So I would say it was like, and I'm really only kind of speaking from my experience because that's where I can speak for my guests, but would be like the rise of like the awareness of postmodernism within the evangelical church, because that's where I started my career and journey. And then to see how that now has become more like deconstruction. That seems to be a really popular word right now, I think, in religion. But how there's like postmodernism has allowed us to kind of start taking things apart. And I think a lot of us have gotten there now to where we're actually able to deconstruct and, like in my case, kind of reemerge as something new. If that makes sense.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Thomas. How about you, Judith?
Well, I'm Judith Schellhammer from the Diocese of Michigan. As the senior citizen here, I think the cultural events the big events that shaped my religious experience have to be initially growing up in a family where World War II was a big shift for most people. And then the Vietnam War and Woodstock and some of the other things happening in the 60s really changed my religious expression.
Good, thank you. Marta?
Boy, I've been like staring at this question ever since you said it. I had, first of all, I'm not sure I've ever paid attention to anything that is in my generation. So I'm solidly Gen X. I'm gonna say Reagan, honestly. Like Reagan and the rise of the phrase, moral majority, religious right, all of those things that were percolating around in my like school days, that in church as a child, like, well, I guess Reagan was president when I was quite young. I didn't think about religion and government as having anything to do with each other whatsoever. Like, we learned separation of church and state. And yeah, Reagan seems to have changed all that in the Reagan years.
Good. Christy, how about you?
My name's Christy. I am in Sebastopol, California, which is Sonoma County, north of San Francisco. I'm the rector of St. Stephen's Episcopal Church. And I feel like I haven't had enough coffee for this question, but the thing that keeps coming to mind for me is, and for some reason is thinking about more like the childhood experiences of the world and the country and church that influence us. And I just remember in a class in seminary having an older classmate. I'm also right at the beginning of millennial, just barely, having an older classmate be so surprised that we grew up in a world that didn't assume church. And I just like never, and didn't assume Christian, that was more interfaith and not assuming church. And I just couldn't shake that, because I think at that point I had never considered growing up in a world that assumed Christian. So I would say that just that viewpoint.
Great, thanks. Selena.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alana. I serve in the Episcopal Church of New Hampshire with Spirit Bound Digital Mission and the Officer for Community Engagement. And for me, actually, so many of the things shared resonate, but I will say the subtlety of growing up and remembering when stores were not open on Sundays.
Yeah.
And then like at a certain point in my own childhood, like that became a phenomenon and more regular that things were open on Sundays. So, the big things that have been named, but kind of, my daughter has never known like a 24/7 open and online world. But that subtlety.
Mm-hmm. Good. Is it Michaela?
Michaela, yes. Hi. I am the canon for children, youth, and families in the Diocese of Central Pennsylvania. And I am a millennial, but I'm like an older millennial. But I was thinking about, I think September 11th was a really big event for me and my generation, like being in high school, and like just the questions it brought up about like war, about the role of religion in our own lives, in the government. How do we respond to when huge tragedies happen? I think it was like just a real shift for me and a lot of other people.
Thank you. Deb.
Hi there, I'm Deb Tickle. I am recently a church planter in Arizona, and I'm now in my new car office in the Diocese of Connecticut. I'm needing more coffee for this too. I think I want to echo what Marta said, like very firmly Gen X. And I think for me, it's a combination of world events, specifically probably the fall of the Berlin Wall and the supposed end of the nuclear war crisis era, but up against I'm part of the earliest of the latchkey kids, which was not my own personal experience, but just noting the sort of the echo chamber that started to develop around, where kids were taking care of each other. So
thank you. Janae.
Hi, I'm Janae Gotzi. I'm in the Diocese of Southern Virginia. I'm currently rector at St. Michael's Episcopal Church near Richmond, but also exploring a new Episcopal community that would be a satellite of our congregation. I guess, I'm kind of like the youngest boomer or the oldest Gen Xer, depending on which set of dates you look at. And a lot of things I've just heard, I came on a little bit late, but I just heard resonate with me. I think I was surprised in 6th grade. I said something to somebody, a friend of mine in class, about God or about church, and it surprised me that they weren't a Christian. Like, I just thought everybody was a Christian when I was a kid growing up. That just was my frame. But certainly had, variety of experiences since that young age. I think for me, I definitely grew up in Christendom, but I think that I have seen it change so that it's no longer the expectation, it hasn't been for quite some time, that you had to belong to a church in order to fit into society. But when I was growing up, that kind of was everybody went somewhere. And yes, there were Jews, and yes, there were Muslims, but everybody had something. And there was kind of expectation that you would have a place of faith that you would call home.
Thanks. But you, Rob?
In the middle of switching devices, so I'll stop this one if it pops up. Rob Colston, I am the campus minister for the Episcopal Diocese of Lexington at St. Augustine's Chapel, and the two things that kind of go hand in hand for me are the rise of the megachurch movement and the Passion of the Christ. Those were two big kind of dividing lines when I was growing up, and especially the Passion of the Christ. If you remember, John Paul II had that famous quote when it came out, "It is as it was," and that put a real line in the sand. Because our high school was real close to a mega church, and so there were a lot of people there was a lot of crossover. So "It is as it was" became a slogan for the megachurch kids from a Catholic Pope that just always stuck in my head. So I'm going to switch devices real quick.
Awesome.
Was that a
Wow.
movie?
Thanks. That actually was a really fun question. Let's see, Roger and Robin and Emmanuel, folks that have their camera off, I would just invite you if you'd like to answer that question in the chat box. Or
We're here.
Roger, you just appeared. Yeah.
Hi, we're at Sewanee. There are 4 of us here, so I have the mic off, so I'm looking you in there. So, but we talked about the advent of the internet was a big one, and then the juxtaposition of Star Wars and the Cold War as cultural clashes for us. But so hi from Sewanee. I'm going to turn it back on.
Welcome, Roger and Swanee friends. Emmanuel, you just appeared too. You grew up in a different place than many of us.
Yes. Yeah. My name is Emmanuel Tuishime, and I'm currently in the USA, in the Diocese of Southern Ohio. Now planting a new church in Beaver Creek, and originally from Rwanda in Africa. I'm sure everybody knows about Rwanda. So when I was 18, back in 1994, I was 18 when you had the genocide. So I was born when my father was a priest in a Episcopal church, and later on he became a bishop in the same church. So by things 1994, everything turned upside down. As a teenager, I was wondering where was God, and at the same time, I had a clear voice come to my head: where was I when my son was crucified on the cross? So God was there. So and where there's a genocide in any country, where there's the genocide, the consequences will affect a generation and generation. So, but as a Christian, we tried our best to find our identity again, to come back to go to normal life. So, which was not a really easy thing to go through, but I was also confused. On the papers and the news, they say Rwanda population, the 90% are Christians, but I could now stand on my feet and say, how come 90% of a Christian can turn to kill one another? So, and I had to work on my faith to see how I can be a better person than who Christian who in Rwanda 1994 war, Yeah, that's me.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to turn this over to Erendira. Erendira and I have known each other for a bunch of years now. We served on the task force for church planting and redevelopment. Oh, that might have been 6 years ago now when we got started. Erendira helps us by facilitating many of our discernment retreats for potential new Episcopal community leaders. And I feel like we just do a lot of like batting around of ideas in this topic of Gen Z, and some of the like known and unknown and mystery and yet to kind of be revealed is something that you've been like playing around with, but not just on an intellectual level, really in relationship with some folks that you mentor and do spiritual direction with. So can I turn it over to you and then tell us what you'd like, and then maybe we can have some conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Katie. Like Katie said, my name is Erendira Jimenez. I'm based in San Diego. And actually, I'll share what came up for me, but the purity culture, I kissed dating goodbye, Jesus is my boyfriend, whole cultural phenomenon was a real marker in my life and the community that I grew up in. So throw that out there as a solid millennial myself. So yeah, as Katie said, I get to do some work with the church planting office with the retreats for folks that are discerning church planting in new missional communities. But day to day, I have a business called Spirit School, and Spirit School started about 3 years ago. I had been working in the Episcopal Church for about a decade. We won't go into my whole work history with the Episcopal Church, but I was there. I was in the ordination process. Lots of life things happened, and came out on the other side feeling like I needed to take some space from the institutional church. Not really sure what that was going to unfold into, but I had a real sense of call to spiritual direction, companioning folks as they kind of explored however they defined and engaged with the divine in their personal lives. And since then, Spirit School has been a lot of things. It's been really fun to be in relationship with a container that's just constantly in flux. So kind of morphed into a decolonial kind of learning and support container, kind of pivoted a little bit more into coaching around, undoing systems, spirituality, decolonizing church, stuff like that. And today, it's still those things a little bit, but my language has shifted into kind of looking ahead, what's coming at us, instead of what's underneath us. So I still do one-on-one coaching with folks. It's kind of a blend of coaching, spiritual direction. I've worked with a lot of folks that are pastors, faith leaders, but I also have a number of folks that are just kind of on the fringes of institution, that are playing with spiritual practices in different ways. And so a lot of the work that I get to see are folks that are kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out of the church world, or trying to figure out if there's ways for them to remain in the church, and if so, how. So that's kind of a broad overview of what I do. I'm currently working through an interview series with different spiritual practitioners and leaders called Visions and they've just kind of shared in their own kind of communities, whether it's breath work, whether it's church planters, whether it's kind of like indigenous human design lens, the things that they're seeing kind of emerging in the spiritual landscape. Some of the folks are Christians, some of them aren't. I also do a lot of work around storytelling and story sharing. So we have a press, and we do a lot of zines. So trying to work with folks in excavating their spiritual stories and sharing that in ways that are tangible, material, and sharing story that way. So that's been really fun. I've been working through a workshop called What's Your Liberation Story for the last 6 weeks. And we have 3 more, and that will end with an actual physical zine that these folks are putting together. So that's a little bit of what Spirit School does. So I, get to work as an artist. I get to work as a story guide, as a story tender, and I get to just really listen to folks of all kind of contexts, communities, generations. But like Katie said, I've been really struck by Gen Z spirituality. I've got a couple of Gen Z directees, and I also, get to chat with the baristas at the coffee shop, and just constantly watching on social media the ways that young people are articulating their spiritual stories, the way that they're making meaning in the world, what they're identifying in terms of belonging and purpose. So those are kind of the 4 words that I'm jumping around with right now: identity, purpose, belonging, and meaning making. It's a strange world out there. I don't know about you all that work with young people, but there's a real sense of fusion that's happening in terms of like spiritual modalities and systems. I'm finding that this younger generation is a lot more willing to hold complexity. They don't need to just identify with one particular tradition or system. There's I'm thinking of one client in particular who is like deeply, deeply traditional in the sense of just like loves liturgy, loves kind of like the mystical kind of saintly experience, but is also like, yeah, I don't need to go to church. And I like to go for communion because there's something really sacred about like receiving the body of Christ. But in terms of like actually engaging week to week or like in a larger community, that doesn't really, doesn't feel as necessary. And they tell me stories about some of their peers and how this one really caught my eye. She was like, oh yeah, I was like talking to some friends. It was like right before Easter, and my friends called me up because they were like rolling at a rave, and while they were just like rolling, they all decided to read the Gospels and the Gospel accounts of like the resurrection. And so they're at a rave on whatever it is that they're taking, and they're just reading the Gospels and having these like moments of like ecstatic awareness of like, oh, this person feels like, Mary in my life, and this person, is like this and this and this. And I was just really struck by the blurring of boundaries in terms of these stories don't need to only be read or heard in these particular settings. They can be experienced and unfolded in various degrees of awareness and in places that are a surprise. I think something that I saw emerging a lot with the millennial generation, but is carrying over with Gen Z, is just like expanding use of spiritual modalities such as astrology, tarot, human design, people really looking for language to help them make sense of themselves and their purpose in the world. Like how do I orient myself in terms of like a larger universe? Yeah, and I think that I have clients that are priests, that are pastors, that have some of these practices in their own spiritual toolbox. And there's a real tension of how do I bring my whole self to this institution and church that I'm a part of, when these practices are rooted in kind of indigenous knowledge, indigenous ways of being, and those are not always widely accepted within the institution. yeah, so I'm going to pause there and see if there's any like questions or comments. If those of you that work with young people, if this is resonating or if you're seeing parallels, or maybe it's just my little corner of the world.
I'll chime in. I just want to thank you for naming that, because it absolutely resonates with my experiences of our younger generation. So thank you.
Now, this is true confession. So besides being a priest in the Diocese of Michigan and doing a lot of work for the diocese, I'm also a residence director in a college dorm. And please forgive me. I know it's got a bad reputation, but I work at Hillsdale College. That's a long story, but that's not my point. A few weeks ago, one of my RAs had been out with a group of students where they were doing evangelism and at a mall, going up to people and trying to present the gospel. And he came back, he was horribly, horribly disappointed, because in his world here, it's very black and white. You're either saved or you're not. And that's, I'd say, the majority of perspective on the campus. It's very evangelical in many ways. And I'm definitely here for the students, not for the administration. So I've got to make that clear. But anyway, and his comment to those of us who were listening was that he was stunned at how many atheists there were. And in his mind, it was either you were a Christian or you were an atheist. And I think that's, and there was a lot of affirmation in the lobby as they were talking. Oh yeah, that's right. And I tried to point out, if he had come up to me in the mall and I had a shopping list where I was trying to get things done, he might have assumed I'm an atheist, because I probably wouldn't have had time for a conversation with him, that. So jumping to those conclusions, but I'm seeing a completely different world. And yeah, so this world is out here too, only hopefully it's not quite as widespread.
Yeah, Judith, that reminds me, thank you for naming that, because I do think that that is a very real culture that in some ways is they're kind of emerging very parallel out of very similar histories. I don't know if you all are familiar with metamodernity or metamodernism. It's kind of this emerging field of study that is looking at what comes after postmodernism. And I can look up the books that I have that are really interesting on the topic. But one of the things is that metamodernity is looking at how do we kind of pull from these different eras. It's not trying to just exist kind of like apart from history. So there's this real sense of like, how do we like glean from the past in ways that are helpful and necessary? And it's more expansive, it's more curious, it's more open. But anytime you have something that's like that wide, there's another side of it that wants to close in and wants more certainty and wants more security and wants more black and white, because the world is becoming too unstable, it's becoming too chaotic, there's too much flux. And so kind of parallel to this like sense of curiosity, mystery, unknown is this other side of, well, now we got to dig in deeper. We got to like really stake our claim in like what we know. And so, yeah, I think those are two sides of the same coin.
Really helpful. Thank you.
I saw Rob unmuting.
Yeah, no, I hear a lot of that. I hear a lot of belonging, right? Being the top line. Not so much purpose-driven life, God has ordained you with a purpose, but more how do I find my way in the world? And certainly belonging to an organization. We've got a lot of students actually. It always sounds dark when I say it. The pandemic was a great thing that happened because it caused a lot of people to ask a lot of hard questions. So we got a lot of young adults that we wouldn't have had otherwise.
Yeah.
And because of our ability to be online right now, we had students in 4 states in the District of Columbia at one point. So the feeling of looking for a place to belong as their full self is absolutely 100% at the top line of what I see
Mhm.
with these beautiful, lovely people who were all born after the year 2000.
Yeah, and I think along with that, like you just named, is this comfort in digital spaces,
Yeah.
and the sense that community doesn't always have to be embodied. So that's a real curiosity for me. I also have found like Zoom and digital spaces to be a place of real deep connection, and I've wondered, how does that make sense with some of our embodied theology, and kind of our this sense that we like gather as like human beings together, when there's just real depth in relationship that can occur through social spaces, social media spaces. So
I
thanks
asked
for
a bishop about, I don't know, 10 or 12 years ago, right at the beginning of the iPhone thing. So I don't know, maybe 15 years ago now, I said, what does the word anamnesis mean in a world where you keep half your brain on a phone, where all of your memories are stored on a digital device? Like how do we remember in those capacities? And I still don't have an answer. I've been thinking about it for a long time.
Yeah. Jonathan, you're unmuted.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this complex relationship with the desire for belonging and what I experience as a real cautiousness to engage. And I think you named that, but the word cautious comes to my mind because I think one of the other fusions or one of the other places where people are really trying to figure things out is around sexuality in terms of identity and gender. Masculine fluid have become more, or masculine and feminine have become more fluid. And in our community, we have a good number of folks, I say a significant number of folks who are in that process. We have one person in the 2 years that they've been part of our community have changed their name 3 times, and are constantly, kind of playing around with different pronouns and trying to understand themselves and in the community. And those folks I find in particular are much more cautious in terms of willingness to kind of step in and engage in community. Love the ritual, like you said, but that belonging piece, they're much more cautious, probably because of some harm in their family system or in their church family system in the past. So
Yeah, thanks for naming that also, Jonathan. I'm seeing a lot of that as well, the gender, sexuality, expression, exploration. Well, I kind of pivot into the next portion that Katie invited me to speak about, which is, how does this actually relate to church planting? And how does this new generation kind of affect how we think about new communities? I don't have any solid answers. But we had a moment. I'll just share this moment that happened after our last discernment retreat. We actually had a Gen Z participant, and the folks of us that were facilitating were all millennial, Gen X, and there was this sense of like, oh, we see these gifts in this person, and they're conceptualizing in really interesting ways. They're practicing already. You like see these gifts emerging in them. But when pressed about like what kind of a community they imagined this experiment that they're doing becoming, they were just like, oh, there's no end goal, right? Like this is what it is. It's just, we just gather for worship. We just gather to sing. And our facilitator was like, okay, but like, when does that become a church community? And they were like, that's like literally not on their horizon. It's not what they're thinking about at all. And so we went back and we had this conversation about, well, how does this fit into, our assessment of them as a church planter? And I just had this moment where I was like, wow, we have our own biases generationally in terms of what we think new communities should be and what their ends are. And we have this whole generation that just may not be looking for church in the form that it is as their end goal. And so what does that mean for folks that are planting or who are engaging with folks who have kind of creative capacities, imaginative capacities? Where we don't impose our visions of form onto a generation that I find to be particularly formless. They are a little bit more floaty than the generations before. They're not as concerned with the container. They're more concerned with the contents. And yeah, I don't know. For those of us that are church planting, this kind of goes back to this embodiment idea. We have for generations been creatures that have a lot of form, a lot of structure. And now we're engaging with a generation that just is not thinking in the same ways that we have. So just in terms of invitation, I think like how we invite younger generations is going to change. But I think it also means that how we do church is going to change. How we gather is going to change. And, you know, Rob and Jonathan, you've already named some of that. I guess a question I have for you is that exciting? Is that scary? Is that unnerving, curious? Like what's the word that comes up for you as you imagine you know, formlessness kind of creeping into form?
One of the interesting parts about our community has actually been that recently, just in the last couple months, we've actually had an increase in a desire to be back in person. And I think it's my bias as someone who, I'm not an ordained person, but I'm a big believer in, you know, ritual and justice. They go together hand in hand. And so I think my community has kind of caught a vision for embodied in person and liturgical worship as countercultural, counter to the things that they feel are pulling them apart. And again, that's my bias, you know, creeping in on them, certainly. But we still are a probably 50-50 online in-person community when we do our Bible study. But when we gather to worship, they show up. And I had 12 people at my Easter Vigil, which puts me in the medium to large category for a small diocese like ours. You know, so there's also this really interesting tension there, right? Like some of this stuff, it's absolutely formless and shapeless, but when it's time to show up, they show up. And so I find myself constantly trying to walk that tension and walk that tightrope, you know.
I love that.
No answers, just observations.
I think that's what most of us have at this point.
I get really excited thinking about this. You know, as a paid professional in the church, it's scary because I don't know how that continues necessarily, especially like longer term beyond my career period that needs to continue. But in terms of church itself, like I do feel so much that the parish structure that I grew up in and that I help lead is a thing of the 70s and is from a time that I don't identify with personally, honestly. And I love pieces of it and I experience God and community in pieces of it, but I also feel this weight of it, of continuing with a model that doesn't fit our lives now, you know, that grew up when women stayed at home and could make the church function because we didn't have jobs, you know. And so all these like square pegs we keep jamming into round holes and insisting they're going to fit again somehow. You know, when you said fusion, the community I'm in is very progressive, pretty darn post-Christian, but really spiritually curious. And so, you know, I do see possibility if we can be in that conversation and show flexibility that is not seen in the news about Christians, that we can be part of that fusion and show people that they don't have to be what they think they have to be part of these communities, or to help us dream and grow a new community. So I get really excited to see what other ways, genuine, real things, not just shiny things that we can point out and say there's young people, but real things where transformation is happening in community that have different containers, or perhaps have more shapeless ones. I'm kind of I'm a J thinker, and so like sometimes I have a hard time imagining what that can be, but I get real excited.
Yeah.
I think I put in the chat relief, because I'm Gen X who should never have been Gen X. I think when I was asked at one point during my process, the proverbial, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And my answer is wherever the work is, right? And offline, out of the context of the formality, I was met with all these questions. Well, what about a pension? Well, what about and that's fine and great, and we need to talk about it. But to my way of thinking, like, the work is where our younger generations are now, wherever the work is. And yet at the same time, that structure is important. I mean, I couldn't stay and continue to lead a community as a layperson that was so focused on the sacraments. And as, the church that we are, that's what we are. So I feel like, our need to be flexible transcends probably the boundaries that even the Gen Zers who want the flexibility know how to do in this moment.
Yeah, your comment, Deb, makes me wonder about something that I was thinking about a couple of years ago that has kind of dropped off my radar, but was the emergence of a lot of like mutual aid communities and collective care. And I think for church planters, the question of like money is always there. It's always like buzzing in the background of, like how do we survive? How do we live? And I wonder sometimes this like younger generation just has a different way of engaging like shared economy. And yeah, I don't know what my thought is there, but I do think that we maybe have something to learn from these different ways of organizing and sharing resources than we have been doing in church historically. So
one of the things that I've been noticing a little bit more from research than direct observation is one of the programs within the Episcopal Church that seems to be thriving in a lot of places is still the Episcopal Service Corps, which at the moment is becoming more and more Gen Z, because I think it tops out at 30 usually. So if you're under 30, you're certainly cusping Gen Z at the very least these days. And I've known a lot of people who went through different Service Corps placements and had this sort of end of year almost sense of betrayal, that, okay, the church just told me like dedicate your whole life to service and good works and good stuff and do it and like live it 24/7 and live with the people you're doing it with. And this is like this amazing paradigm. Okay, your year's over, go now, pay off your student loans, go find unrealistically priced real estate, housing, like go, we loose you into the world of hopefully end stage capitalism. You'll be fine. And interestingly, I also had a conversation with somebody, so solid boomer generation, who had done some supervising of Episcopal Service Corps type stuff. And one particular program that he was associated with that will remain nameless, the goal of the program was basically to recruit more young people for the church at the end of the year. And the directors of the program were constantly annoyed that kept not happening, that these young people went through the program, got better skills and capabilities and capacity, and then went off into largely the nonprofit sector, because of course these are young people who like want to do good stuff, but they all left the church. And it seems to me that the only avenue we provide for the young people who are really excited, who are like not only catching on fire for Jesus, but also for like doing stuff with that, we give them a year, we might re-up them for a second year, and then we toss them out into the wilderness. And they are outside of the church, you know, clubbing together and buying big old Victorian houses to do a better version of 60s communes. And, you know, the invention of Venmo has completely revolutionized how those kinds of collective economies can be streamlined. And I feel like the Episcopal Service Corps is doing something really good, and then it ends and we don't really have an and, unless you want to go to seminary and become a priest, which is like a great thing and is not everybody's vocation.
I'm a former ESC director, actually. So I definitely resonate with what you're saying there. And I think that it is like a really beautiful taste of what community can be. And I know I'm not involved right now, but I know that they're having conversations about that. Like how do we make it more than that? And like make sure that the end goal is not just we're recruiting people for the way that the church is right now, but that we're reimagining how the church looks in general, and like how you fit into that, and how you carry on the mission wherever you are. I mean, that was definitely a tension that I felt in my program, kind of getting pressure from some congregation members of like, come on, we're recruiting people to come to the church, right? And I was like, no, that's not what this is. And if we look at, you know, all the different places these young adults are now and the ways they're contributing to the community, it's cool to see. But I also, like, on the flip side, like, I was kind of surprised sometimes that we had some young adults who really wanted that structure and that kind of the more traditional piece paired with some more flexibility in what that looked like. So I thought that was a cool blend to see. Like, that's what a lot of Episcopal Service Corps young folks were attracted to.
Yeah, I think that blending is spot on, Michaela. Jonathan, you put in here, I find one of the fascinating things in this is that one of the big critiques of Gen X was how we didn't stand for anything. All we wanted to do was rage against the institution and that we were formless. I wonder if there just like weren't people within the institution that could hold space for that. And so there was no other way to go than to just like give in, right? Like, so that's why like the conversation that came up with us assessors the other day felt so important. It was like, oh wow, we have both a responsibility and an opportunity to allow this emerging generation kind of the gift of exploration that many of us didn't receive. We have an opportunity to kind of imagine communities in new ways that allow for all of this tension to exist, so that they don't end up, 20 years down the road, just like in the same place that Gen X is now, just this like sense of frustration and constriction. So I do think we're talking about this as church planters and thinking about, how do we hold the tension of this flexibility and tradition? How do we hold the tension of wanting to belong and also not being sure if we belong or not sure if our whole selves are actually welcome? For the introverts and the socially awkward, like knowing that structure is important. It helps us. For folks that are neurodivergent, like knowing that there's a script is really important. It helps us know that we're not going to be come undone. So there is an important need for those things, and also the ways that we have had structure don't necessarily have to be the ways that structure exists down the road. And so I think this is an invitation to really rethink our form, rethink our structure, so that there is space for what's unknown, for what's emerging, and for what's swirling, to have space for that. I really don't think that this is an either or invitation. Yeah.
I just want to offer that it in a lot of ways, it seems as though like the institution has been living in kind of like a monoculture. Like this is what it means to be church, and this is how you start being a mission and move to being a parish or a program sized church from a pastoral sized church. And I feel like this is the time where there's kind of like the soil is being tilled and the ecosystem is widening, and the institution needs to respond to it because the institution isn't thriving in the garden of the monoculture anymore, right? So I think there's so much, and my church plant coach talks about just those partnerships between traditional churches, established churches in that model, and church startups, and that there's like, we need to also draw on each other and challenge each other because there's a lot to be offered within that system. But I think that cultivation of the biodiversity of the ecosystem is the call of the institution right now. And really being able to avail ourselves of that in a way. So I just want to offer that to this group.
Thank you, Elena. Yeah, we're I think just about at time. So Katie, anything we need to talk about to wrap up?
I just wanted to point out, Alana, you got some amens in the chat box here. This was really good. Maybe if it's okay with you, Erendira, I'm just gonna throw out the idea of a cohort. Just because I feel like folks that might have been interested in this conversation might be interesting partners as we started to put that together. So right now, Erendira is also facilitating a cohort for us on decolonizing church planting and what that means to do some deconstruction and reconstruction, particularly with people of color. But one of our dreams is either at the end of this year or next year, whenever we're able to do it, to perhaps offer some kind of cohort with members of Gen Z who are interested in church planting, new Episcopal communities, but in a really generationally contextual way. So not sure quite what that will look like, but I wanted to put it on your radar in case that sparks something within you and you might be in touch with us about what we could be thinking about. Let's see, a few announcements for you. As you probably already know, the new Episcopal grant application is out and in the open. There's a deadline coming up May 1st, but that doesn't have to be a sign that you should panic. There will also be one definitely August 1st and probably in the new year as well. You can find it on the website. And then please stay in touch and continue these conversations. In the chat box, I'm putting a link to join our Mighty Network. It's just a social platform that we've been using to try to have some conversation. There's articles and just kind of like interesting ideas that we're throwing out there. And so really encourage you to join that. And Erendira just put the link to Spirit School in the chat box.
Yeah, some fun interviews in there. Just you can see what we're doing. I also do coaching for folks. So if that's something that you're interested in or just having a one-off conversation, I love those as well. So feel free to reach out. I'll put my email here too.
All right. I'm going to officially close us. So if you need to jump off and go to the next meeting, it's not awkward. Go ahead and do that. Erendira, thank you so much. So interesting. Oh, I was going to say something. I'm going to leave the Zoom space up for another 5 minutes or so if there's anybody that wants to ask me questions about grants or anything like that, or just chat about Gen Z. And if there's any resources, any books or podcasts or videos or something that you would share with us or kind of around this conversation today, that's an invitation to everybody. Would you throw those in the chat box and I'll make sure I can send them out? All right. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.